This morning, I made my daughter pancakes like it was the last time I'd ever get to do it. Maybe it is. There's a jar that says so, anyway, sitting on the counter, waiting. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I need to start at the beginning, when we found the attic, when I still thought I was discovering something instead of becoming part of it. I'm 34. I teach middle school English in a town in the Appalachian region so small we don't have a stoplight. My husband died 2 years ago. Aneurysm. Sudden. The kind of thing that makes you stop trusting mornings. We moved out here afterward, me and our daughter Emma. She was 6 then. The house was cheap because it had been empty for almost a decade. The realtor kept saying estate sale, like that explained the price. The attic wasn't mentioned in any of the paperwork. We found the pull-down ladder 3 months after moving in, hidden behind insulation in the hallway ceiling. Emma spotted the seam when a water stain spread across it during a storm. I went up with a flashlight on a Saturday. The space was bigger than I expected. Full standing height, proper floorboards, electrical outlets that still worked, and jars. Several of them were arranged on industrial shelving that ran the length of the space. Mason jars mostly, but also mayonnaise jars, jam jars, anything with a metal lid. Each one had a label. Masking tape, handwritten in different inks and different hands. Margaret Sims, last morning, April 3, 1987. Robert Kelso, final hour, November 12, 1991. The dates went back to the 60s. I counted 47 jars that first day. I took photos. I texted them to my sister, who called me immediately and told me to get them tested for mold or asbestos or worse. But they weren't dusty. They looked like someone had been maintaining them. I brought one down. I don't know why. Maybe because the name was familiar. Dennis Prather, who'd owned the feed store when I was a kid. The label said, last morning, June 8, 2003. I remembered him dying. Stroke, I thought. Or maybe it was cancer. The jar was sealed tight. When I finally got the lid off, standing at the kitchen counter with Emma at school, nothing came out. No smell, no vapor, nothing. I tilted it. Empty. Then the kitchen changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the light shifted, became thinner, grayer. The coffee maker was gone. The fridge was a different model, older, avocado green. The calendar on the wall showed June 2003, and Dennis Prather was sitting at my table. He didn't see me. He was staring at a mug of coffee, not drinking it. He looked terrible, gaunt, yellowish. He kept touching his left arm, rubbing it. The clock on the wall behind him showed 6:47 a.m. I watched him sit there for 53 minutes. He didn't move much. Near the end, he stood up, walked to the window, looked out at a yard I didn't recognize, and said, "Well." Just that. Then he sat back down. The clock hit 7:40, and everything went white for a second, and I was back in my kitchen, alone, holding an empty jar. I sealed it again immediately. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I didn't tell anyone. Who would I tell? I put the jar back in the attic that night and didn't go up there for 2 weeks. But I kept thinking about it. About how he'd touched his arm. How he'd looked out the window like he was saying goodbye to something he couldn't name. I started looking up the names on the other jars, cross-referencing them with obituaries at the library. Every single one matched. Dates of death, names, all of it. I opened another jar, then another. It became a routine. After Emma went to bed, I'd go up to the attic, choose one, bring it down. I told myself I was documenting something important, that someone should witness these moments. They were all the same, essentially. Someone's last hour, usually at home, usually alone or nearly alone. A woman making breakfast she wouldn't eat. A man watching television he wasn't seeing. Most of them seemed to know, on some level. You could see it in how they moved, how they touched things, slowly, carefully, like they were already saying goodbye. I started recognizing the rooms. My kitchen appeared in 11 of them, my living room in 6. The people I was watching had lived in this house, or they'd visited it, or something else I didn't understand was happening. After the 23rd jar, I noticed the house was changing. Small things first. A chair in the living room that I didn't remember buying. A crack in the hallway wall that spread in a pattern I'd seen in one of the visions. Emma asked me when we got the new curtains in her room. I hadn't bought new curtains. I stopped opening the jars. I lasted 4 days. The problem was, I felt closer to my husband during those hours. Watching other people's endings made mine feel less isolating. I know how that sounds. But when you've held someone's hand while they stopped being themselves, when you felt them go cold while you were still talking to them, you'll understand why watching strangers die felt like companionship. I opened 3 jars in one night. That was my mistake. The overlapping was subtle at first. A coffee mug from 1979 appeared on my counter and didn't disappear when the vision ended. A section of wallpaper from 1985 replaced part of my kitchen wall. Emma asked why her door was suddenly blue. It had been white that morning. I started finding objects I didn't own. A hairbrush with someone else's gray hair still in it. A pair of reading glasses on the bathroom sink. Shoes by the door that didn't fit either of us. Emma started talking about the people she saw in the house. At first, I thought she meant in the jars, that she'd been watching me somehow. But she described them wrong. Different people, different times. She'd see them in mirrors, she said, or reflected in windows, just for a second. An old woman in the hallway. A man in the basement we don't have. I sealed the attic, nailed boards across the access panel. But I'd already opened 56 jars. The house continued stitching itself together. Rooms would shift. I'd walk into the bathroom and find fixtures from 3 different decades installed simultaneously. A toilet from the 70s, a sink from the 90s, tiles from 2003. They functioned. Everything functioned, but nothing matched, and every surface carried someone's ending in it. Emma stopped sleeping well. She'd wake up and tell me her room smelled like cigarettes, or that her bed felt different, or that she'd heard someone walking around even though we were alone. I checked for carbon monoxide, mold, electrical issues. Everything came back normal. Last week, I found a new jar. It was sitting on the kitchen counter when I came downstairs, clean, sealed, labeled in handwriting I recognized because it was mine. Emma and Mom, last morning. The date was blank. I threw it away, took it outside to the trash. When I came back in, it was on the counter again. I'm not opening it. I won't. But it's still there every morning, and the date field is slowly filling in. Not all at once, one number at a time, appearing overnight like something is writing it while we sleep. So far it says, March 1. That's 8 days from now. I've thought about leaving, packing Emma up and driving away, but I don't know if distance matters. The house has already woven us into itself, the same way it wove in everyone else who ended here. And when I look at Emma now, really look at her, I sometimes see her in double. The version that's here and the version that's already been recorded. The one who knows this is her last morning. She looks different in that version. Calmer. Like she's already made peace with something I haven't told her yet. I keep thinking about all those people I watched, how they knew, how they moved through their final hours with that terrible, gentle certainty. This morning, I made Emma's favorite breakfast. Pancakes, strawberries, the real maple syrup we save for special occasions. She asked why, and I told her I just felt like it. She smiled at me the way she used to before the house started changing, and I tried to memorize that smile, the exact shape of it, just in case someone, someday, opens our jar and needs to see what our last morning looked like. I want them to know we were gentle with each other at the end. There's something wrong with my family, and I didn't know it until a bus trip last fall. I thought I was just tired, burned out. Turns out I was carrying something heavier than that, and so was everyone else. I'm 34, work in data analysis for an insurance company, and I'd been feeling disconnected for months when my aunt organized the family reunion trip. Not depressed exactly, just hollow, like I was going through motions I'd memorized but never understood. The Blue Ridge Parkway seemed harmless enough. Scenic views, fall colors, a rented bus for 23 of us. Easy. I noticed the mileposts around hour 2. We'd been climbing steadily, the bus groaning on switchbacks, when my cousin Derek pointed out we'd just passed milepost 384. 10 minutes later, milepost 381. I thought maybe the parkway just numbered differently in sections. Mountain roads do strange things. My Aunt Linda was navigating from the front seat, her phone in a dashboard mount. She kept frowning at it, refreshing the map. "We should have hit the visitor center by now," she said. Our driver, a quiet man named Hayes we'd hired through the tour company, just nodded and kept going. Milepost 378, then 375. "We're going backwards," Derek's daughter Emma said. She was 16, the kind of observant that makes adults uncomfortable. "The route loops around," Linda said, but she didn't sound sure. At milepost 370, Hayes pulled into an overlook, said we should stretch our legs. The view was stunning, endless ridges and shades of rust and gold under an overcast sky, but the parking area was empty. No other cars, no tourists. The wind had a weird quality, dense and pressing. My Uncle Frank didn't get off the bus. We all noticed, but nobody said anything at first. He was sitting 3 rows back, staring straight ahead, hands on his knees. My aunt called to him. He didn't respond. Derek went back inside. I watched through the window as he touched Frank's shoulder. Frank's head turned slowly, mechanically. His mouth moved. Derek stumbled backward down the aisle and practically fell off the bus. "He's talking about the mill accident," Derek said. His voice was shaking. "He's describing it, every detail, like he's there." Frank had never worked in a mill. His father had, died there in 1967, crushed between rollers when a safety mechanism failed. Frank was 8 years old. I'd heard the story once, years ago, at a funeral. Frank never talked about it. We got back on the bus. Hayes started driving without being asked. Frank was still talking, low and rhythmic, narrating something we couldn't quite hear from the front. The words had a cadence like testimony. Milepost 365. Linda was calling 911. No signal. She tried texting. Nothing. Derek tried his phone. Same. At milepost 362, we pulled into another overlook. Hayes stopped, turned off the engine, and said, "Someone needs to get off here." "Why?" Linda demanded. Hayes looked at her in the rearview mirror. "Because it's waiting." I don't know why Emma stood up. Maybe because she was young enough to still trust that adults had answers, or old enough to know we were pretending we did. She walked down the aisle and stepped off the bus. She stood in the parking area for maybe 20 seconds. Then she started screaming. Not in fear, but in pain. Describing something. A fire. A house fire. Smoke and heat and locked doors. Her great-great-grandmother, we realized, died in 1931 when a kitchen fire spread and the doors swelled shut in the heat. Emma had never heard that story. It wasn't one we told. Someone, I think it was Derek, tried to pull her back onto the bus, but when he touched her, he froze too. Started talking about a drowning. His grandfather, 1953, fishing accident on a lake up north. Details no one should know. The exact temperature of the water. The way the line wrapped around his ankle. They both got back on eventually, went quiet, sat down, stared forward like Frank. We kept driving. Milepost 359, 356, 353. At 350, Hayes stopped again, looked at Linda. "Your turn." She refused. Hayes didn't argue, just sat there, engine idling. After 5 minutes, Linda got off. She lasted longer than the others, almost a minute before she started talking. A stabbing. Her great uncle, 1945. An argument over money that ended in a kitchen in Philadelphia. When she got back on, her eyes were different. Hollow. The pattern was clear now. Every few mileposts someone would be called. No one could explain how we knew whose turn it was, but we knew. The pressure built in your chest, your ears rang. You stood up because not standing was worse. At milepost 344, it was my turn. I stepped off into cold wind that smelled like asphalt and something underneath. Wet earth, maybe, or old metal. I felt it immediately. The pull. Not physical, but inside my head, like a memory being dragged to the surface. And then I was talking. I described a hanging. My great-great-grandfather, 1889. Not a suicide, an execution. I don't know how I knew that. He'd killed someone, a business partner, over a debt. I described the scaffold, the crowd, the exact way the rope was tied. I could feel the splinters in the wood under my hands, even though I was standing on pavement. When it released me, I got back on the bus. I understood why the others had gone quiet. Speaking was too much effort. Everything felt far away. Milepost 338. We were down to 18 people who hadn't gone through it yet. The bus felt smaller, darker. Hayes kept driving. At milepost 330, my cousin Rachel broke. Started screaming that we had to go back, that we had to tell someone. Hayes didn't stop. Rachel tried to force the door open while we were moving. Derek and another cousin had to hold her. "What do they want?" Rachel kept screaming. "What are we supposed to do?" No one answered, but I think we all knew. There was something wrong with us, with our family. Some through line of violence or guilt that had been buried and was now being excavated, death by death, generation by generation. At milepost 320, Hayes spoke again. Someone has to say it, the true thing, the thing you all know but don't say. We looked at each other. I saw it on everyone's faces, that flicker of recognition. We did know something, not consciously, but it was there, in the silences at family gatherings, in the stories that got cut short, in the way certain names were never mentioned. Milepost 315, another stop, another person called off. My second cousin, describing a fall. Industrial accident, 1978. A poisoning, bad medicine, 1902. We were running out of people. The mileposts were counting down, and we were counting down with them. At milepost 300, Linda spoke. Her voice was hoarse. The land. Everyone went still. The land the family bought in 1887, Virginia, where Grandpa Warren built the first house. It wasn't for sale. The man who owned it, he didn't want to sell. She stopped, swallowed, continued. They made him sell. They hurt his family until he signed it over. His daughter. That's what I heard once, just once, from my grandmother right before she died. She said her grandfather did something unforgivable, and we'd been paying for it in pieces ever since. The bus went silent. Then the engine started without Hayes touching anything. We began moving, but the mileposts stopped counting down. We passed 300 again, then 301. They were going up. Within 20 minutes, we were back in normal traffic. Other cars appeared. Cell signals returned. The sky looked ordinary. Hayes pulled into a rest stop and said our trip was over. He'd drive us back to the start point. No one argued. We didn't talk about it afterward. A few people tried in the parking lot where we'd started, but the conversations died out. It felt safer not to examine it. We all went home, back to our lives. But I've noticed something since then. I'll be working or grocery shopping or trying to fall asleep, and I'll feel it. That same pressure in my chest, that ringing in my ears, like I'm about to be called off the bus again. And I've started researching. The land Linda mentioned. I found records. The original owner's name was Nathaniel Kern. His daughter was 8 when she disappeared in 1887. They never found her body. The land was sold 2 weeks later. My family built their first house on that property. Every generation since has lived within 50 miles of that spot. I don't know what we appeased by confessing, or if we appeased anything at all. Because sometimes, late at night, I hear mileposts counting in my head, and they're not going up anymore. They're going down again. There are 52 doors in my house now. I counted this morning. When I moved in 9 years ago, there were 11. I'm not confused about the number. I'm not having a breakdown. I know exactly when each new one appeared, and I know where they lead. That's the problem. I'm 43. I run a foster care home in western North Carolina, in the Appalachian region, up where the ridgeline still catches fog most mornings. I've had my license for 11 years. Before that, I was a social worker. Saw enough to know what these kids need isn't complicated. Just consistency, quiet, someone who doesn't leave. I'm good at that part. Or I was. The boy came to me in October. 8 years old. Name was Michael, though he didn't answer to it much. His caseworker said he'd been through 4 placements in 6 months. Selective mutism, possible attachment disorder, nothing violent. Just wouldn't bond, wouldn't speak. I've had harder cases. He arrived after dark. I remember because I had to turn the porch light on to see his face when Karen brought him up the steps. He was small for his age, dark hair, holding a grocery bag with his things. He looked at the house for a long time before he'd come inside. Not scared looking, just looking. That first week was normal. He ate what I made him, went to bed when I told him to. Didn't cry, didn't fight. The other kids, I had 3 others then, mostly left him alone. He'd sit in the living room and watch them play, but he wouldn't join in. I didn't push it. They come around when they're ready. It was the second Tuesday he was with me that I noticed the door. I got up around 6 like always, started coffee, let the dog out. I walked past the hallway that leads to the back bedrooms, and there was a door I didn't recognize. Not new construction. It looked old, actually. Wood grain, dark with age, brass knob tarnished. It was just there, between Michael's room and the linen closet, where there'd been wall before. I stood there holding my coffee and staring at it. I wasn't afraid yet. I thought maybe I was misremembering the layout. Old house, additions over the years, maybe I'd just never noticed it. But I'd lived there 9 years. I painted that hallway myself. I opened it. Inside was a small bedroom, single bed, floral quilt, morning light coming through a window that shouldn't exist because that wall backed onto the hillside. There was a woman sleeping in the bed, older, maybe 70. I could hear her breathing. On the nightstand was a glass of water, a paperback novel, reading glasses. I closed the door carefully, walked back to the kitchen, drank my coffee, told myself I had imagined it. But when I went back, the door was still there. I didn't open it again that day. I got the kids up, made breakfast, drove them to school. Michael didn't speak, same as before. I kept looking at him in the rearview mirror. He looked out the window the whole drive. When I got home, I opened the door again. The room was empty, bed made, everything tidy. The windows showed the same morning light, even though it was almost noon by then. The next door appeared on Thursday. This one was in the living room set into the wall beside the fireplace. Green paint, chipped at the edges. When I opened it, I saw a kitchen I didn't recognize. Small, outdated, a man at the table reading a newspaper, coffee steaming beside him. He didn't look up. The newspaper was dated June 1987. I closed it, checked on Michael. He was in his room, sitting on the floor, drawing. He'd been drawing the same thing for days, a house with too many windows. I called my brother that night, asked him if the layout of the house seemed wrong to him, if he remembered it differently. He said I sounded tired, asked if I was sleeping okay. I told him I was fine. Friday, 2 more doors, one in the upstairs bathroom, one in the hallway near the stairs. I opened the bathroom one and found an old man shaving at a sink, humming something I almost recognized. The hallway door opened into a child's bedroom. A little girl sat on the floor playing with wooden blocks. She looked up at me and smiled, but her eyes didn't focus right, like she was looking through me. I started keeping count. By Sunday, there were 11 doors. Michael still wasn't talking, but he'd started standing in front of the doors, not opening them, just standing there with his hand on the knob, listening. I asked him if he saw them too. He nodded. I asked him if he'd opened any. He shook his head. That night, I heard him get up. I followed him downstairs. He walked to a door I hadn't seen before, one that had appeared in the coat closet. He opened it. Inside was a birthday party. Kids around a table, cake with candles, adults in the background. Everything slightly blurred, like a projection. Michael stepped inside. I grabbed his arm, pulled him back. The door shut on its own. He looked at me for the first time with something like expression. Not fear, something else. "They're not yours," I said. He pulled his arm away and went back to bed. The doors kept coming. Different rooms, different moments. Always morning scenes, always the same soft quality to the light. I started noticing details. The people in the rooms never acknowledged me directly, but sometimes they'd pause, like they'd heard something. A woman folding laundry would look toward the door. A man drinking coffee would glance up, then away. I called the caseworker, tried to explain that something was wrong, that Michael needed a different placement. She asked what specifically was wrong. I couldn't answer in a way that made sense. She said she'd check in next week. Michael started spending longer periods in front of the doors. He'd stand there for an hour sometimes, his ear pressed to the wood, listening to the muffled sounds of other people's mornings, other people's lives. I found him one night trying to wedge his shadow under one of the doors. That's how it looked, anyway. He was lying on the floor, pressed against the gap at the bottom, and the shadow he cast from the hallway light seemed to be moving independent of him, stretching toward the door like it wanted to slip through. I pulled him away again, put him back to bed. In the morning, his shadow wasn't attached right. It lagged behind him when he walked, stretched too long in the wrong directions. He noticed. I saw him looking down at it, tilting his head. That afternoon, I found him in one of the rooms. I'd opened a door looking for a towel. I wasn't even thinking anymore, just opening doors. And there he was, sitting at a breakfast table that wasn't mine, across from a woman who was reading a newspaper. She was saying something about piano lessons, about being home by 4. Michael was nodding. I said his name. The woman didn't react. Michael looked at me. His shadow was on the floor beside the woman's chair. When he came out, he left it there. After that, he started talking. Small things at first. Yes and okay and thank you. The other kids noticed. They said he seemed better, happier. I got a compliment from his teacher about his participation in class. But his shadow stayed wrong. Some days it was barely there. Other days it was sharp and dark but didn't match his movements. I was the only one who seemed to notice. The doors multiplied, 20, 30, more. I lost count. They were in every room now, even rooms that were too small to hold them. I'd open a cabinet and find a door instead of shelves. The closet had 3 doors inside it, each leading somewhere different. Michael opened more of them. I'd find him sitting in other people's mornings, eating breakfast at their tables, listening to their conversations. He'd come back with things he shouldn't know. He told me about a neighbor's mother, mentioned her name, details about her childhood. I asked how he knew. He said she'd told him at breakfast. The neighbor's mother had been dead for 6 years. I tried locking him in his room at night. He'd still be in the rooms come morning, sitting in someone's kitchen, someone's den. The doors weren't just in my house anymore, or the house had become something else. Last week I woke up and couldn't find the front door, just more of the others. I walked through my own house like a stranger, opening doors into morning after morning, looking for a way out. I found Michael in a sunroom I'd never seen, sitting with an elderly couple. They were talking about their daughter's wedding. Michael was nodding along, smiling. His shadow was gone entirely by then. I finally found the front door behind the refrigerator, moved the whole appliance aside, and there it was. Walked outside and stood in my yard until I could breathe again. Michael's caseworker came yesterday. She said he's made remarkable progress, bonding well, communicating, showing real attachment. She asked what I'd been doing differently. I didn't tell her about the doors. There were 46 now, maybe more. I don't open them all anymore. Michael came home from school today and went straight to a door in the kitchen, opened it onto someone's breakfast nook, stepped inside, sat down at the table like he belonged there. A man offered him orange juice. He said, "Yes, please." I stood in the doorway watching. The man asked Michael about school. Michael told him about a test he'd taken, a book he was reading. Normal conversation, the kind I'd tried to have with him 100 times. The man's shadow was too long as well, and the woman's, standing at the counter. When I looked closer, everyone in that room had the wrong shadow, or no shadow at all. Michael looked back at me from the table. He was smiling, really smiling, not the empty look he'd had when he arrived. I closed the door. I'm writing this because I need to say it somewhere. The house is full of mornings that aren't mine, and Michael is trading pieces of himself to live in them. He's happier than I've ever seen him. His teacher says he's thriving. But yesterday I saw my own shadow lag when I walked past a mirror, just for a second, just enough to notice. And this morning, when I opened the cabinet to get coffee, I found myself looking into a kitchen I recognized, my kitchen. But it was empty, and the light was wrong, and I could hear someone moving around just out of sight. I didn't step inside, but I wanted to. I stood there wanting to for longer than I should have. The door is still there. I keep walking past it. I still check my face in the mirror sometimes, just to make sure it's the right one. It's been almost a year since I left Ridgecrest College, and I know that sounds paranoid, but you have to understand. I watched 6 students start forgetting their own names, and toward the end, I started forgetting mine too. I was 26 when I took the job at Ridgecrest College, fresh out of grad school with a degree in atmospheric science that I wasn't entirely sure what to do with. The position was temporary, just 9 months covering for their regular meteorology instructor while she was on sabbatical. It was a small liberal arts school in the Appalachian foothills, the kind of place where everyone knew your name by the second week. I thought it would be quiet, a chance to figure out my next move without much pressure. The college sat on a series of terraced slopes, buildings clustered along natural ridgelines that ran roughly north to south. The campus was old, built in the 1890s, and the layout followed the terrain instead of fighting it. Main academic buildings on the upper ridge, dormitories stepping down the eastern slope, the library and archive building tucked into a saddle between 2 hills. It was pretty in that faded, neglected way small colleges often are. I met Dr. Raymond Kelter during orientation. He was in his late 60s, the sort of academic who'd been at the same institution his entire career. Taught history, specialized in regional folklore. He had an office in the archive building, which doubled as the college's small museum. We ended up chatting over coffee in the faculty lounge, and he mentioned something that stuck with me. "You'll want to keep an eye on the temperature inversions here," he said. "They get peculiar in winter." I asked what he meant by peculiar. "Cold air pools in unusual patterns, doesn't always settle where you'd expect, moves sometimes." He gave me this look, half amused, half serious. The old-timers used to call it the Cold Island, said it wandered the ridges. I laughed it off. Temperature inversions are common in mountainous terrain. Cold air is denser, sinks into valleys, sometimes creates pockets. Nothing supernatural about it. But I filed it away because it seemed like it might make for an interesting class discussion. Classes started in late September. I had mostly freshmen and sophomores, teaching intro meteorology and a seminar on climate patterns. The students were earnest, underprepared, but generally likable. By mid-October, I'd settled into a rhythm. That's when the reports started. It began with a student in my Tuesday seminar, a quiet kid named Marcus. He came to my office hours looking exhausted, said he'd been having trouble sleeping. His dorm room had been weirdly cold for the past 3 nights, cold enough he could see his breath, even though the heating system was working fine. His roommate felt nothing. I suggested he talk to maintenance, maybe get a thermometer to document it. He nodded, but seemed unconvinced that would help. He missed the next 2 classes. When he came back, he looked worse, thinner. There were dark circles under his eyes, and he had this odd mannerism I hadn't noticed before. He kept touching his own face, like he was checking to make sure it was still there. I asked if he was feeling all right. He said he'd moved to a different room, that the cold had followed him. And then he said something I initially thought was a joke. "I think I'm turning into something else." I started paying attention after that. 3 more students mentioned unusual cold spots over the next 2 weeks, always localized, always moving. One girl said the cold had started in the west stairwell of her building and migrated to the 3rd-floor hallway over 4 nights. Another described waking up to find frost on the inside of his window, but only on the left pane, and only between 2 and 4 in the morning. I set up some basic monitoring equipment, digital thermometers, a few data loggers I had from my grad research. I placed them around campus, focused on the areas students had mentioned. The data I got back was strange, but not impossible. There were cold pockets, definitely, but they didn't correlate with ventilation patterns or building heat loss. They moved, but incrementally, a few degrees colder than surrounding areas, migrating 10 or 15 feet over the course of several hours, always upslope, always along the ridgelines. I brought it up with Dr. Kelter. He didn't seem surprised. "You're measuring it," he said. "That's good. Most people just experience it." Experience what, exactly? He walked me down to the archive, to a climate-controlled room in the basement where the college kept its older records. He pulled out a box of documents, journals from students and faculty going back to the 1920s. A surprising number of them mentioned the cold, described it in different ways, a chill that followed them, a pocket of winter that refused to leave, air that felt wrong. Several entries mentioned vivid dreams. A few described personality changes, students acting out of character. "What happened to them?" I asked. Most left, transferred, dropped out. A few stayed, finished their degrees, went on to normal lives. But some, he pulled out a leather-bound journal from the 1940s, flipped to a marked page. Some became part of the folklore. The entry was from a student named Evelyn Marsh. She described feeling watched, followed by cold air that smelled like pine and old snow. She wrote that she'd started forgetting her own name, that when she looked in mirrors, she saw someone else, an older version of herself, or maybe a stranger. The final entry was a single line: "I know what I'm supposed to become." Evelyn Marsh never graduated. There was a brief notation in the college records that she'd withdrawn for health reasons, but no details, no forwarding address. I asked Kelter if he thought there was a connection between the temperature phenomenon and the psychological effects. "I think," he said carefully, "that certain environmental conditions can amplify suggestibility. Folklore has power. If you're told a place is haunted, you start interpreting ambiguous experiences as evidence. Cold is disorienting. Sleep deprivation makes you vulnerable. The mind fills in gaps." It was a rational explanation. I wanted to believe it. By early November, 6 students had reported symptoms. The college administration was aware, but not particularly concerned. No one was in physical danger, and the complaints were vague enough to attribute to stress, seasonal depression, the usual pressures of academic life. I was told to continue monitoring, but not to alarm anyone. I started tracking the cold more systematically. I mapped its movement across campus using time-stamped temperature data. It followed the ridgelines, just like the folklore said, but the pattern was inconsistent. Sometimes it would linger in one location for days. Other times it would jump 100 yards overnight. It always moved uphill, though. Always. I also started noticing changes in the students who'd reported contact with it. Marcus stopped coming to class entirely. I saw him once, crossing the quad, and almost didn't recognize him. He was walking differently, slower, with a kind of deliberate carefulness. When I called his name, he turned, and for just a moment I couldn't place his expression. It wasn't fear or confusion. It was recognition, like he knew something I didn't. Another student, Jenna, began dressing in clothes that didn't fit her style, old-fashioned, almost Victorian. When I asked about it, she said they felt right, comfortable. Like coming home, she said, and laughed in a way that didn't sound like her. I started reviewing the archive material every evening. The accounts were consistent over decades. Students exposed to the cold began acting strange, adopting mannerisms and speech patterns that seemed borrowed from other eras. Some claimed to remember events they hadn't lived through. Others simply became quiet, withdrawn, as though listening to something no one else could hear. And then there was the detail that made my skin crawl. Several of the old accounts ended up in the archive themselves, not as external reports, but as first-person journals written by the affected students. They would document their own transformation, describe the process of becoming whatever they were turning into, and then nothing. The journals would just stop. No resolution, no explanation, just the final entry, usually something calm and accepting. The college had been collecting these accounts for over a century, adding them to the archive like specimens. I confronted Kelter about it in mid-November, asked him directly if he thought the archive was somehow preserving these experiences, maybe even encouraging them. He looked at me for a long time before answering. "The archive documents," he said. "It doesn't create. But documentation has a way of making things real, doesn't it? Once something is written down, witnessed, preserved, it becomes part of the record, part of the place." That's not an answer. "No," he agreed, "but it's the truth." I should have left then, should have finished the semester remotely, cited family emergency, anything. But I was in too deep. I needed to understand. I started spending nights in the archive building, where the cold seemed to concentrate most frequently. I set up more equipment, kept detailed logs. The temperature would drop in specific rooms, always the ones containing the oldest records. The cold moved through the building like it was searching, pausing at certain cabinets, certain shelves. On the night of December 3rd, I felt it myself. I was in the basement archive room, reviewing a box of materials from the 1950s when the temperature dropped 15 degrees in less than a minute. My breath misted, the lights flickered but stayed on, and I still don't know how to describe this, I felt noticed. Not watched, noticed, like I'd stepped into the attention of something vast and patient. I left the building, went back to my apartment, tried to sleep. I couldn't. The cold had followed me. Not physically. The apartment was warm, but I could feel it, a presence just outside my awareness, waiting. Over the next week, I started changing. Small things first. I'd reach for my coffee mug and my hand would hesitate, like it wasn't sure how to grip it. I'd start to introduce myself, and the name would feel foreign in my mouth, not quite mine. I began having dreams about the college in different eras, seeing buildings that had been torn down before I was born, knowing the names of people I'd never met. I was becoming part of the archive. I could feel it happening. I tried to document it, started writing everything down, thinking maybe if I could describe the process, I could control it, stop it. but the act of writing just made it worse. Each entry I made felt like I was cementing the transformation, turning myself into another account for the collection. I stopped writing, stopped going to the archive, avoided campus except for classes I couldn't cancel. The cold receded, slowly. The dreams faded. After Christmas break, back in January, I felt almost normal again. But not quite. I finished the semester, didn't renew my contract, left Ridgecrest in May and took a job with the Weather Service in a flat coastal city where there are no ridges, no inversions, no folklore about wandering cold. I'm fine now. I function normally. I have a life. But sometimes, when the temperature drops unexpectedly, I feel that attention again, that sense of being noticed, and I catch myself touching my face, checking to make sure it's still mine, still the right shape. Last month, I got an email from Dr. Kelter. He's retired now, but still has access to the archive. He said they'd recently cataloged a new acquisition, a journal from a visiting meteorology instructor documenting unusual temperature phenomena on campus during the 2025-2026 academic year. He attached a scan of the first page. It was my handwriting, but I never wrote a journal, never left anything behind. I should respond to his email, ask him where he found it, what else it contains, but I'm afraid of what the later entries might say. Afraid they might describe a version of me I don't remember being, a transformation I thought I'd avoided. The archive documents what happens, it preserves the accounts, and now, apparently, I'm part of the collection. I tell myself the journal is a mistake, some kind of clerical error, that someone else's notes got mislabeled with my name. I tell myself the cold was just weather, the changes just stress, the attention just imagination. I tell myself a lot of things, but I've started checking mirrors more often, looking for signs that my face is becoming someone else's. Just to be sure. Tomorrow, I'm having dinner with my brother. I've spent the last 2 weeks trying to remember a single moment with him. Anything. His voice, his laugh, a fight we had, a game we played. Nothing comes. But my mother insists we grew up together, and every photo in her house agrees with her. I'm 34 years old, work as a medical records clerk at Middlesbrough General, and I've lived in this town my entire life. I'm telling you this because what happened last month has made me question whether that's even true anymore. The wishing slot sits in the Bell County Historical Museum on Cumberland Avenue. It's just a metal chute, really, painted black, about 3 feet tall, bolted to the floor in the back corner past the Civil War exhibit. The placard says it was part of a traveling carnival that came through in 1936. People would whisper wishes into it and drop a penny down. The carnival left town without it. No one knows why the museum kept it. That there it is, mostly ignored except by bored teenagers on field trips. I never paid attention to it growing up, never whispered into it, never dropped a penny. I'm not superstitious. But 3 weeks ago, my supervisor Karen mentioned that her daughter Emma had started talking about a sister named Beth. Emma is 14, an only child. Karen laughed about it nervously in the break room, said Emma insisted they'd grown up together, shared a bedroom, the whole thing. Karen checked with her husband that night. He remembered Beth too. So did the photos on their phone. 2 girls in matching Halloween costumes, birthday cakes with 2 names. Karen took 3 days off work. When she came back, she didn't mention it again. I probably wouldn't have thought much more about it, except that same week, I ran into my neighbor Dennis at the grocery store. Dennis is 67, retired from the mine. We were in the produce section, and he asked how my brother was doing. I don't have a brother. Dennis looked confused, then irritated, like I was messing with him. He described him, younger than me, worked at the tire shop on Winchester, had that red truck. I told Dennis he was thinking of someone else. He walked away shaking his head, muttering my brother's name. Michael. I heard him say it clearly. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Karen's daughter, about Dennis, about the certainty in his voice when he said Michael's name. The next morning, I drove past the tire shop on Winchester. There's a kid who works there, maybe 25, with a red pickup. I'd never seen him before. I sat in my car across the street for 20 minutes, watching him change tires. He didn't look anything like me. At work that Friday, I pulled my own file from the records room. It's against policy, but I needed to see it. Under emergency contacts, there were 2 names, my mother and Michael Hendricks, brother. The handwriting was mine. I put the file back and went to the museum on my lunch break. The wishing slot was exactly where I remembered. The museum was empty, except for the volunteer at the desk, some old woman doing a crossword. I stood in front of the chute for a long time. The metal was cold when I touched it. There was a coin slot at the top and a small opening, maybe 2 inches across. The placard said people used to whisper wishes, and the carnival workers would make them come true with sleight of hand, small tricks, harmless fun during hard times. I didn't whisper anything. I just stood there, and then I left. But I started noticing things, small things. The Thai restaurant on 4th Street that everyone talked about like it had been there for years, I drove past that corner twice a week for work, and I'd never seen it before last month. My coworker James mentioned his wife's book club, said they'd been meeting at the library every Tuesday for the past 5 years. I'd worked with James for 3 years. He'd never mentioned a wife. I started keeping a notebook, writing down inconsistencies. The problem was, I had no way to verify what was real. My memories felt solid, but so did everyone else's, and they contradicted mine constantly. I'd mention something about the town, and people would correct me with absolute confidence, and I'd pull out my phone to check, and the internet would confirm their version, not mine. The Thai restaurant had a Facebook page going back 6 years. James's wife had a public Instagram full of book club photos. The tire shop kid, I looked him up finally, had a last name of Hendricks and a family photo from 2019 that included a woman who looked exactly like my mother. I went back to the museum 2 weeks ago. The old volunteer was there again. I asked her about the wishing slot, whether people still used it. She smiled and said, sure, kids mostly, sometimes adults. They don't take it seriously, she said. It's just a novelty. I asked if anyone had used it recently. She thought about it, then nodded, said a woman had come in maybe 3-4 weeks back, middle-aged, really upset about something. She'd stood at the chute for a long time, crying. The volunteer had almost asked if she was okay, but then the woman whispered something into the slot, dropped in a coin, and left. Did you hear what she said? I asked. The volunteer shook her head, said it was too quiet. I went home and looked through my entire apartment. Photo albums, old school records, everything. There were pictures of Michael. Birthday parties, Christmas mornings, him in a football uniform. I was in the photos too, older, standing next to him. My mother had her arm around both of us. I don't remember any of it, not one moment. I called my mother that night, asked her about Michael. She sounded confused, asked why I was asking weird questions about my own brother. I said I just wanted to hear about when we were kids. She talked for 40 minutes, told me stories about us growing up, how I'd helped him with homework, how we'd fought over the TV. Her voice was warm, happy. These were her memories, real to her. When I hung up, I sat on my couch for 2 hours. I tried to remember any of it. I concentrated until my head hurt. Nothing came. Just the same childhood I'd always remembered. Lonely, quiet, and only child in a too big house. But everyone else remembers different. I started asking around carefully. Found out more. The Thai restaurant on 4th had opened after the old hardware store burned down in 2019. Except I remember that hardware store being there until at least 2023. I used to buy light bulbs there. But when I drove past, the building's facade had that weathered look of 6 years of wear. The paint was faded in a way that doesn't happen overnight. Last week, I went to the library and pulled old newspapers. The hardware store fire was reported in May 2019, front page. The photos showed the building engulfed in flames. I read the article 3 times. 2 employees died. I didn't recognize their names, but according to the paper, one of them had worked there for 30 years. I never heard about this fire. I would have remembered. 2 people died in a building I walked past regularly. That's not something you forget. Unless you weren't there. Unless for you, it didn't happen yet. I tried to find the woman who'd used the wishing slot. The museum volunteer couldn't describe her well. Brown hair, maybe 50s, average height. That's half the women in Middlesbrough. I spent days wandering around town, looking for someone who seemed haunted, desperate. I didn't know what I was looking for. Then yesterday, I saw Karen in the parking lot after work. She was sitting in her car, not moving. I knocked on her window. She looked at me, and I could see she'd been crying. I asked if she was okay. She said Emma had been having nightmares, waking up screaming about losing her sister. Karen had taken her to a therapist who suggested false memories, maybe from a movie or book, but Emma kept insisting, kept saying Beth was real and something had happened to her, and why couldn't anyone else see it? I asked Karen if she remembered Beth. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said yes, every photo, every memory, every moment. But she also remembered Emma being an only child. Both versions were true in her head. The therapist said it was stress, some kind of break, but Karen said it felt like something else, like her brain was trying to reconcile 2 different lives, and both were hers. I didn't tell her about Michael. I just said I was sorry and left. I drove to the museum last night after they closed, parked across the street and watched the building. I don't know what I expected to see. After an hour, I went home. This morning, I checked my records file again. Michael is still listed, but now when I look at the handwriting, I can't tell if it's mine or not. I think it is. I think I wrote his name there. I have a feeling I did, but I don't remember doing it. I called the tire shop earlier, asked for Michael. The kid who answered said he'd stepped out, but would be back in an hour. I could leave a message. I hung up. I keep thinking about what the woman whispered into the wishing slot. What regret was so unbearable she'd trade it to a Depression-era carnival prop? And I keep thinking about Karen's daughter, about Dennis, about the hardware store fire I never knew happened.